For those of you who are not familiar, there was a CBC radio ideas show called Community and Its Counterfeits as well, which is still available. You can get the transcript. And I'm told that it is one of the most requested transcripts of all programs put on by CBC Radio Ideas Show. So three-part series, so 3 hours. And as Paul said, many of the themes of that series made its way into the book, or vice versa. I think they were probably happening about the same time. John, this is new. This is a new experience for me.
And me.
I know probably a little bit more about your background than a lot of people here do, and I'd like them to learn a little bit more about your heritage, your background, some of the events that have shaped your life and then have gone into your thinking around asset-based community development, but also beyond, because we'd like to conclude our discussion with that great Canadian saying, "Where's the puck going?" So we'd like to conclude the discussion by exploring where John is going in his own thinking, kind of, I call it post-ABCD thinking. But before we do that, John, you dedicate the Careless Society to your mom, Angus Rose, and to your dad, John Allen, who taught you, in your mother's case, to love community, and your dad to seek community. What would your parents say about community today?
I was born in 1931. Nobody else in this room must have been born that long ago. And that was, the Depression was on full scale at that time. I lived in a sort of a lower income neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio. Working class neighborhood, I would say. And it was also a neighborhood where a lot of people began to come from the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky. We would say today Appalachians. Back then they would say hillbillies. And my mother was an Irish American. And maybe in the early 30s, Appalachian family came and moved into the house next door to us. And I know that really worried my mother that they didn't have clothes that she thought were clean, didn't seem to be healthy, didn't speak English correctly. So she sort of warned us against associating with them. And then Mr. Thal, the husband of the family next door, lost his job. And immediately, my mother went next door and said to Mrs. Thal, "I'll make dinner for you till he gets a job," each night. And it was 4 years before he got a job. And so every evening there were 5, I had one brother and sister, there were 3 children and 2 adults in my family, and then there were 4 in the Thals. And for 4 years my mother took dinner to them because my father had a job, wasn't a good paying job, it was a job. And we had a car, wasn't a good car. Still moved. And Mr. Thal, when he had to really go someplace, would come next door to us and ask my father to drive him, as did some other people in the neighborhood. Now, what we know historically is that my mother was not acting as an individual. She was doing what people did. And at least in the United States, we know that the New Deal reforms didn't even reach neighborhoods till about 1935. So there were a third of the people unemployed. for probably 5 years at least before relief came, and nobody started in the streets. Because people took care of each other. And when I was about 30, I was reflecting on this whole experience, and I said to my mother, you know, why did you take dinner all those years over to the Falls? Because you don't like hillbillies. And she said to me, well, they were my neighbors. And that was the answer. So she was saying, I lived in a culture that said, in a place, the people here support each other. And it would be unheard of and exceptional if you didn't do what you did. So I think if they were here today, they would wonder how many people in how many neighborhoods, when people are unemployed or their houses are going into foreclosure, would step forward and say, we're with you, we'll do this. And so I think the great adventure ahead of the people in this room is, how can we carry in for each other? And not by saying just hello or having a block party, but by saying, my food is your food. My car is your car, because you are my neighbor. And so that's what I think she said.
So would you see yourself as, was that an inspiration? Do you see yourself carrying out your mother's business, your father's business? Have you ever seen it that clearly, or is it just, was it a natural evolution for you as you became a community organizer?
I'm sure they had influence. I don't think I thought about this question until I was 30.
Yeah.
Right. I went back and
because you seems to me you took a detour. I mean, you were in the armed services, but then after that you came out and you became an elocutionist. Did you not? Did you study elocution?
Oh, in the university?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Now that's a strange, isn't it, a topic for the best or most renowned, most famous community organizer in the world?
Well,
so there's a secret here, maybe.
Yeah, there is a secret. I was in a department at Northwestern University, I mean as a kid, a student, which was called Public Address and Group Communication. And it had a major focus on communication in small groups. It's a developing field, but very much at home.
Yeah.
In that sense. More important was that there was a faculty of 7 in that department. And when we were new students, they all, I remember, sat up on the stage. And the head of the department stood up and said, we are here to try to aid you in developing the skills of being good citizens. I wonder how many universities do that today. I know the one I came from doesn't. It is now a technocratic trade institute. And I think so much of what we call education has drifted into a celebration and a life within the culture of technology. And it gets expressed in one way at universities with a heavy focus on methodology, whereas we had a heavy focus on community, on the meaning of associational life, on the value of discourse and debate.
people in this room may not be familiar, but you've brushed shoulders with 3 presidents. I got that correct? One wasn't a president when you brushed shoulders with him. I don't know if you've brushed shoulders with him since he's become a president, but there was the Kennedy, Johnson, and then Barack Obama. I think you're very proud of the work you did when you went into government, or became involved with the Kennedys, and then after his assassination with President Johnson.
Well, in Chicago, where I've lived almost all my adult life, I got to know a man named Sergeant Shriver, who was the brother-in-law of Bobby and Jack. And he was head of the Catholic Interracial Council in Chicago. And I was involved in the race relations field. And so when Jack was elected, he chose people to come into the government. He was a transition director. And Jack Kennedy signed an executive order requiring all government contractors to engage in a now famous phrase, affirmative action. And so nobody in the government knew anything about what affirmative action might be. It meant more than stop discriminating. You're going to have to do something affirmative to correct the past. And so they recruited some people to come in and form a team to establish affirmative action, and I got in there because of Sarge as one of those people. And it was a huge learning for me about government. We were able, in 3 years, to change what was going on in terms of employment of African American people in the United States. More in 3 years than had happened in all of history, because of the power of the government to begin to affirmatively say, we in no way will support discrimination by anybody that gets our money, and we will require you to do more than that. And so I've always had this deep respect for the power of government to do certain kinds of things, and not respect for ability to do other kinds of things. And I need to sort of distinguish. But this was a huge, wonderful liberation movement that just swept through American industry within 3 years. Now, I learned another thing. Maybe 20 years later, it occurred to me that Hitler probably had a bureau in his government, which he used for the exact reverse purposes of the group I was in, to promote discrimination and to have affirmative action to eliminate people of the Jewish heritage. So what that says to me is governments are amoral. They're not moral, they're not unmoral, they're amoral. And so the real question is, how do we keep them moral? And I think they'll never do it internally. And what we mean by democracy is the possibility that in combination citizens might keep the government, which is amoral, on the moral side of the equation. But citizens, I think, start locally. And if locally people don't have the experience of working together to make their society more livable. And they are individuals who are just consumers. The democracy's on the way out. Democracy is the land where citizens have power to have a vision for the future and the capacity to be the principal producers of that future. And those are the powers from which the democratic experience and I think possibility of the bigger systems grows.
So to take it back to your mom and your dad, if there isn't much neighborliness, if there isn't much caring, there likely isn't much democracy.
That's right. I linked the two very strongly in my mind, that every question of strengthening community is about strengthening the base of democracy. They are the same phenomena. A citizen is not a consumer. And if you are an individual living in a neighborhood who says hello to 3 or 4 people, and that's your collective experience as neighbor, right? And you basically buy your life from professionals and corporations. That's got nothing to do with democracy. It's the opposite of community. And so the basic experiential base for democracy is our knowing what a neighbor means. And then we can speak to the people in power to say, you reflect what we do, right? You support what we create.
There's a paradox here, though, isn't there? Because the state has now expropriated citizenship. They define it, they confer it.
Oh, you mean legally?
Legally. And what you're arguing is, in a real sense, is to yank it back, take it back, bring it back where it belongs, strengthen it, nurture it, grow it, and that will, in turn, strengthen the state as a manifestation of democracy.
You said it better than I did.
But, and so, so would that be the fundamental aspiration of asset-based community development?
Is to enhance democracy and community. Those two things. But they are the flip side of the same coin. Yeah.
And community is tied up with care,
Yes.
with neighborliness, and the like.
And productivity, the capacity to come together to make our lives better, not to buy our lives, but to create a life that's better.
So, John, one more question in terms of your background. If we were to read any author or series of authors who most influenced you, or these are people that you might go back and reread even now. So if we wanted to understand a little bit more about your own thinking, your heritage, your own political philosophy, what books would you recommend, or what authors would you bring forth as being the most influential on your own thinking?
Well, I started out my professional life as a neighborhood organizer, and the godfather of neighborhood organizing at that time, and still for a lot of people, was a guy named Saul Alinsky. Anybody here know Alinsky? Okay. And his sort of basic guide is called Reveille for Radicals. Reveille, like wake up, wake up. And so that certainly was a major influence on me. In fact, I read that book when I was in high school and decided, because of reading the book, that that's what I wanted to do. And then I went to college in Chicago, and there was Alinsky. So it was a big, huge influence on me. And then the other person is Ivan Illich. How many of you today, not so many 60s, everybody would have held up their hands. But Illich wrote a whole series of books, any of which I could commend. You could go to the library or the internet and you could see all the books that he wrote. The one that I think might have been the most influential was one of his earlier books. It's called De-Schooling Society. And it is a profound critique of institutional production of something called education. Illich once said, and I got to know him very well, and he once said to me early on, he said, John, how did you ever get this touching idea that the way you would know something is by going to a school? I'm sort of touched. Did you have that idea? Where did that ever come from? It's like somebody might say, what? How did you ever come to believe that if you put a leech on your body and it sucked the blood out, you'd be better? How did you ever get to this curious place of believing the way you would know things? It's in school. And he had a huge influence on me because he gave me words for what I knew. And so I can commend that, or if you go to another book of the same ilk called The Medical Nemesis, for people who believe that the profession of medicine has much to do with health. This book will help you understand that that's a curious belief, and that it's a misleading belief. So a whole series of books like this. I picked those two early in my life.
And David Cayley, who you've worked with, as Paul mentioned earlier, has two books, I believe, out. One is In Conversation with Ivan Illich, and the other is Rivers North of the Future, which I also commend to you, which is a treatise on Illich's thought. So both Canadian perspectives on Illich's thinking.
One of the things that Illich helped me so much with is to never start your thinking with the institutional assumption. If you're concerned about health, never start by saying, what can we do about medicine? If you're concerned about knowledge and wisdom, never start by saying, how can we have a better school? And right across the institutional spectrum, start with the condition you're interested in and say, how can our neighborhood be a place that is the basic source of healthfulness? Not. So, for anybody in policy work, it seems to me that a lot of policy work, and I worked at a research institute, it was a policy research institute at the university, that trying to figure out how an institution can finally work by having it do more of what it's been done won't work. That we're sort of at the far end of what an institution can do for our well-being. In fact, we may be past the place. And so we are now at that place where if you can see the limits of institutions as the source of well-being, but we obviously are not well, where do you turn? And that's what this gathering's about. We turn to community.
So when you put your ABCD glasses on, is what I think you're talking about is a way of seeing first, a way of thinking, a way of framing before we begin doing. what do you see when you put your ABCD glasses on? Do you have one lens, a couple of lenses? Are there some basic principles that help you when you're in the midst of a situation and it's not entirely clear what the dominant assumptions are, how to sort out what the institution believes with what I believe, what's best for the constituency I'm part of, etc. What do you see?
Well, I'm maybe clearer about that than I used to be. That little time before. What I see if I'm in a discussion, the place that I'm coming from, what I see is that there is in every neighborhood a huge invisible set of possibilities that aren't identified or discovered. That the capacities, resources, assets, and possibilities of neighborhoods tend to be invisible, whereas what institutions do, right, is always visible, it's accounted, advertised, proclaimed, but if health has more to do with the relationship of you and your neighbors, there's all kinds of research that shows that. Where is that visible? Who pays attention to that? What policy might in some way support that, right? So, at this point in my life, I am most interested in the processes that make visible the invisible capacities that exist in local people's own abilities and the associations that they create. And a lot of our work today is how do you do that? And I have a couple of workshops where I'm going to explore that in more detail, so I won't go into it.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it is the gifts, the capacities of individuals. But what I think you're doing is pushing that into a collective vehicle, right? So it's in relationship.
Yeah.
Gifts are given in relationships. It's the associational life.
Yeah.
And that's what you look for when you're looking in the community. It may not be in a guidebook, maybe a Legion Club or a Weavers Club or a Pottery Club, but it may not be in that. So that you're to understand a community first, you're looking.
That's right. Yeah. And for people here from Canada who are interested, years ago I had some opportunity to be with some people in Prince George, and they became aware that they didn't know what the associational base is there. And so a small group of people who call themselves Project Friendship work with the local junior college, and they created a community directory of associations. And there were back, this is probably 10 years ago, and there are 1,230 associations there. And you could get that if you go to Project Friendship in Prince George. I think on the internet you could get this directory. And there's nothing I could commend more to enhance the visibility of the possibilities of the community than for us everywhere to begin to say, look at this rich associational base. And we've just completed a study in a small town in which we've tried to identify all the associations and the public benefits they provide. And it's just incredible when you see what is coming in terms of welfare unseen and unrecognized by the associational life of locality.
So I'm glad you mentioned Prince George. It seems to me your work has grown in fertile soil here in Canada. There is a terroir for looking at community neighborliness, asset-based community development in Canada. And I'm curious about your reflections as a very well-known Canadian broadcaster, a little bit better known than David Cayley once said that the definition of a Canadian is that you are as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. and so we've conferred that status on you as well. But you're an American, you spend most of your time there, but you've been back and forth to Canada for years and years and years. Even before you were working, you were vacationing in Quebec, and I think well understand our country. What is it about the soil in Canada? It's not that it's better or worse, but that that is fertile for the concepts of asset-based community development.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that because there's been more interest in our work proportionately in Canada than in the U.S. And so why? I spent so much time, I spent a third of my life here. And I can, at least from my perspective, I think there are several reasons. The first is, at a local level, it's pretty clear to me that there's a culture of cooperation that is much stronger than the local level in the U.S. And that, you know your history better than I, but I think it grew out of a different kind of history. It wasn't a history that glorified the frontiersmen and the cowboys and that whole idea. Second is something that you sort of joke about in Canada, but it's just a gift to me, and that is a kind of egalitarian humility. I just feel there's a lack of arrogance here, and that's a great gift. It allows you. The worst thing in the world is, in the United States, that we have this huge military, which allows us to always think that the way you solve a problem is with a gun. But if you don't have that, it allows you to be a real problem solver, because you never solve a problem with a gun. In that sense, I think the lack of arrogance grown from not having the imperial impulse is the other. It's just one of what I feel each time I'm with the group here. And the other thing has to do with scale. There are 10 times more people in the United States than there are in Canada. And I must say, one of the things that really strikes me, because I'm with small groups and neighborhoods in the U.S., and I'm with small groups of people in neighborhoods in Canada, and there's a difference. And the difference, generally speaking, is that in Canada, to my amazement, I can hear a group of people in the United States talking in a neighborhood about what could be done, and then concluding they can't do it because everything is too big, too out of hand. It's not handle work that you can do. But because of scale, I think, here, I just constantly am amazed. I'm in a room of 10 people, and they're talking about something that might be done, and they get done. And you know why? They believe they can do it. They believe that they can make their vision come true. And that belief is the threshold to all local change. But if I don't believe, I have a vision, but I don't believe I can make it come true, then slowly but surely I become cynical and isolated. So the scale, there's something wonderful here that I see over and over again, and that is people doing what community and democracy are all about. sitting down, coming to a common vision, and then saying, and we can do this. I learned so much, I think. In Canada, it seems to me that there is more of what my mother would call being neighbor, if you're asking that question, than I would see in most places in the U.S. for the reasons that I just indicated. And so that's why I always learn when I come here, because I'm seeing something I desire more than I can usually see it in the U.S. However, I think in the larger sense, both Canada and the United States and all industrialized societies have this major, major force pushing toward professionalism, technology, big systems as the way to make a better life. And so resisting that and having an alternative is the future of community and democracy, I believe. There is nothing, having great institutions, improving, reforming our institutions, has nothing to do with democracy. When I was a kid, the greatest institutions were in a place called Germany. If you were sick and you had a lot of money, you went to Germany to be cured because their medical system and doctors were better than ours. So the 20th century gave us two great lessons about this force.
Yeah.
One's called Nazi Germany, great institutions, no freedom of expression or association. And then we tried another way, and it's called Soviet communism. Great institutions, no democracy, no freedom to give your gift, no power to have an association. So what we're talking about here, maintaining to reviving, is what makes a democracy. And all our investment in being better professionals and making our institutions better will never come to anything in the long run if we don't have people whose gifts are shared locally and who in their associations together envision and carry out and produce a place that is healthful, wise, just. So we're in a struggle. But the wonderful thing is that every one of us lives in a place that is or can be a community. So the great possibility is where you live. And discovering what people know and can do there is a major force in the redefinition of what's the center of society. If community, as Paul says, is the center of society, then what's there? And what is there is a rich set of gifts and capacities and a powerful set of associations. And they're invisible. They are what makes democracy. In our associational life, we take the three powers that makes a democracy. The power to decide what needs to be done, the power to decide how it will be done, and the power to do it. And to the degree that we give those three powers to institutions, we have lost the only power that makes a difference in the long run, and that's the power of the citizens.
John, I want to talk just a little bit, come back to one of the fundamentals of contribution of associational life, which is the care that we give collectively. And it's almost like there's two definitions of care out there. And Ivan Illich, who you mentioned earlier, when he read your book, The Careless Society, said that the most fundamental concept in your book was that, I'm just going to read it here, is that one definition of care is masquerading as love. So here I think he was talking about the care that's been usurped by professionals, by institutions. And I think you would agree it's not really care. And then there's, it comes out of services. And then there's the care that almost has no name, because the dominant discussion around care is the care within a service delivery system. That was your perspective 20 years ago. Would you say that has much changed in that? And the reason I ask that is that my sense is that the majority of people that you speak to are professionals, and who are well-meaning, good-hearted, and want to do a good job and care. There's no question about it. And they exist within caring professional circumstances. Have you been able, do you think, to discern a shift there at all? Is there a reclamation of the natural care, or are we even more dominated today than we were when you wrote your book, than we were 20 years ago by the professionalized care system?
I think in almost all the professional fields, there's a wing that has developed in the last 20, 30 years of people who recognize the dilemma of how do we interface with local people at local place in ways that are not imperial, that are not replacing their capacity. So I think that's changed for the good. That you can see it in public health. You can see it in actually in police departments. You can see it in education. You can see it even in corporations. So there's an increasing body of people, I call them a wing, of each institution who are much more aware than they were of this kind of dilemma. And I think that's the positive thing. And I'll bet you that's who's in this room. A lot of the people who are in this room, that's who I am. I work with the university. So that's good. Now, if we have that consciousness, how do we act? And one possibility is that we say, well, I'm here on the wing, and what I'll try to do is influence the whole institution that have this kind of orientation and consciousness. And that's one direction people are taking. Another direction says, well, I'm on this wing, and what I can do is engage the institution in a way that it is not imperial and replacing community production, and maybe even enhancing it. Right? The one is an internal use of our position, the other is an external use of our position. So I see people doing both of those, and a lot of institutions have somebody that they designate as having community relations functions. And so one of our ABCD faculty members in Wisconsin gathered a meeting of people who work for all kinds of institutions, from corporations to hospitals to universities to police departments, who had this relationship, this responsibility for a relationship, the institution's relationship with local community. And there were 40 of them came together, And it was the most joyous experience I've heard. Did anybody here have that function or responsibility? Would you raise your hand? At any rate, they loved each other because in the institution they were doing something that nobody else did. And in the community they were known as institutional people, accepted it. So they were alone and they came together and they called themselves gappers. We work in the gap between the institution and the community. So that's emerging more and more. People who see themselves as the bridge. Right? And that's a very important kind of role and function.
Yeah, good. Thank you. We're getting close to the end of our time, John, at least this section of the agenda. But what crossroads are you at?
Yeah.
Where's the puck going for you? What are you chasing now? Is there a post-ABCD perspective that you're pursuing?
Well, I think I've moved away from thinking much about programs and organizing at the local level, which is what I have respect, interested in that area. But more and more to me, the question is, here, when Peter Block and I, you'll see him this afternoon, his image, and we're writing this book, The Abundant Community. At one point, we were trying to say, what would an abundant community, a group of people in a place who understood abundance, what would that place be like? And so we were enumerating at one point what would be manifested by people. And I said, I remember vividly, well, there would be kind people who would be important to have some kind people in the community. And Peter said, well, I don't think so. Not in the abundant community. He said, I think an abundant community is a place that has a culture that says to everybody, come on, you're kind. It's a culture where the message of our collective being is, we're kind. And that's where I am thinking most and sort of looking at neighborhood experiments in a way. It is as Peter and I were writing the book, each time I would come to Cincinnati as we would work on it, we would meet with a group of people who had different kinds of definitions. We met with a group of wealthy suburban women. We met with their husbands separately, and then we met with people from a German working class neighborhood, and then all kinds of gatherings. We asked them, tell us what this community means to you. And then finally, there's still in Cincinnati, a port of entry for people from the mountains and the hills. There's a community where people who call themselves hillbillies live. The wealthy women, whom we said, what does this community, this place mean to you? You could see a silence. And then one said, you know, I know about my neighbors because many of us have the same maid. And so the maid tells us about each other. That's the relational density. So then we're sitting with a group of Appalachians. And we asked them to talk about community. And I said the word, I said, you have a culture here didn't understand what I was asking. Said a few more words, and a man there said, "Oh, what you're asking is, what is our way? What is our way?" And it just opened up the whole discussion. And so he said, "You know, you come here on Saturday morning, and we all have our cars, not on the street, but up on the grass. And we're all washing our cars together." And he said, "We know the rest of the people here think we're hillbillies look down on us. But you know what we think? They are so incompetent they can't even wash their cars." And another man said, "If I come home late at night, drunk, and my wife has locked the door, I know that I can go next door."
So, John,
wait,
you got one more?
I don't want to.
This is coming in handy.
These are the ones that stuck me because they sounded humorous, but they meant it. But then they had all kinds of descriptions of what they do, especially in support of children, right? And so then we began asking people in other places, can you say, what's our way here? And hardly anybody could answer the question. So that's where I've shifted. The question is, what's our way? Because otherwise, the way is the institutional, technological, professional way. So we're going to have our way, and that's the growth of a culture of commitment and competence locally. I'm sorry.
Thanks. And I want to end with perhaps a question we could frame as advice to a young person. So to pick up on your theme, I think you and I are in the same boat. Likely many of you in the room, either you're young or you run into a lot of young people who I think feel a terrible burden and a terrible pressure to solve the challenges that we've left them with. And the list seems endless. The approaches are not clear. The burden is overwhelming. It's probably not a unique generation, but there's no question it's a terrible burden that many young people feel. To get it right, to get it big, to do it fast, and whatever. What advice would you give to a young person who believes in caring, believes in community, understands citizenship grows there, understands unless that's strong, our democracy isn't strong, and we can't make our democracy do what we want to do unless it's strong. What advice would you have for them?
At one level, we'll be talking about this in one of the workshops. I'd say, can you be the connector in your neighborhood, on your block?
Yeah.
But in a larger sense, I think a lot of people are frustrated by how big the dilemmas seem as against the capacities that they see at their own command. And that's true of most industrialized societies, right? However, I would say, and this only can happen if you're as old as I am, right? One of the things I was involved in early in my life was what was then called race relations. And we were doing all kinds of little things that didn't seem to make much difference. And then, but they were doing the same thing in New York, Georgia, California, Oklahoma. These little things. And then one day, 7 students at the University of North Carolina decided they were going to go to to a segregated dime store, cafeteria, and sit there and eat in a place that said whites only. That's all. 7 kids. And all of a sudden, all the little stuff that we had been doing those years that looked like it wasn't much got connected, and the civil rights movement was there. All great movements are not, there are no movements I've ever seen organized. Movements occur when the basic atomic structure of locality and concern and action is finally ignited. And we all know this because after those people who had this lunch ignited the civil rights movement, one woman wrote a book, a woman named Betty Friedan, about women and liberation. And the book was like a spark, and the women's movement became visible and powerful. And then after that, there was a day when actually a senator thought it would be a good idea to convince some universities to sponsor Earth Day. And so a lot of universities sponsored it. And the next day, all of the thousands of things that people had been doing because they loved their cake to life and came together, and we had the environmental movement. And the same one night when the police beat gay men in a bar in New York City, Stonewall. Then it all came. I know, young people, that you are in a movement. Keep doing what you're doing, because ahead something will ignite it because of what you're doing, and then it will sweep the consciousness and the policy of your country. Never fear, I can guarantee you that as an old guy.